So now that you know where I'm coming from, the first section that I'm going to be discussing is how to avoid conflicts between your own plugin and other plugins or WordPress themes. And the first subtopic in this section is how do you avoid conflicts with jQuery. If you're not familiar with jQuery, it's a really powerful library that can let you create content that's going to be very dynamic. It's a JavaScript library that you can just load and then do things like have things fade in and fade out and slide and do easy AJAX queries. Now, while jQuery is great, and whenever you're using it, you can do very amazing things, it can also wreak total havoc on your site if you try to load more than one instance of jQuery. Now, that can happen if users or developers are not careful as they're developing themes or as they're writing their plugins. Now, here I would say that some plugins and a lot of themes make the mistake of directly loading their own copy of jQuery, even though there is one that's already delivered with WordPress. WordPress uses jQuery in a lot of the admin backend pages to be able to do things like the things we see, the fade in and fade out when you approve a comment or delete something. All these different things use jQuery in the back. Now, if users go in and load their own copy of jQuery, there's a good chance that it won't be the same one as WordPress and that it's going to conflict with other plugins or themes that are using jQuery on the page. Now, the way to actually avoid this type of problem is to call this wonderful function that's available in WordPress that's called WP enqueue script. And so you can call it with a single parameter, which is jQuery, and then it's going to load the jQuery up on your page. So the way this works is by just specifying jQuery here, it's going to load the version of jQuery that you provide with that is provided with WordPress. Now, the other thing it's going to do is it's going to manage requests to load jQuery from all themes and plugin, or from the theme and all of your plugins that are currently installed on the site, and make sure that it only loads once. So this way you can be sure that you're not going to have 5 versions of jQuery loaded on the site. You're only going to have a single version that gets loaded and that's going to be available. Now, that being said, you can still have issues with people not using this, or people who give different names to their version of jQuery, but already that can alleviate a lot of pain. Now, this function can actually be used for your own scripts or for other plugins and scripts that you find on the web. So there's up to 5 parameters that can be used for the WP enqueue script function that can let you load any kind of JavaScript onto your site. So what you need to specify for the script function is a handle, the source, dependencies, version, and whether it should be in the footer. And you can also use something similar for styles. So if you have CSS style sheets that you need to load on the site, then you could do this. And again, if somebody else happens to be using the same CSS for a similar plugin, then it's going to only load once by using this function. Now, one thing to be aware of is that what these functions do is that they queue up these different requests, and then they output them inside of the WP head function call that's going to be inside of the theme header. So if you're trying to troubleshoot jQuery issues, the place that you should be looking is going to be in the page header, obviously. That's where your different references are going to be all related to jQuery and loading it. So what you're going to look in there is you're going to go down inside of the headers and just do a search on the word jQuery and see if you find more than one instance of that in there. If you do, well, there's a good chance that you'll find different versions, and that might be what's or would be what's messing up with your different jQuery content on your page. Now, something to be aware of concerning jQuery, if you are going to use the method that I've just mentioned and load up the WordPress version of jQuery, is that it uses a no conflict version of jQuery. Now, in this version, you actually need to write out the jQuery function name, and you can't just use a $ shorthand version of that function to be able to do all of your different jQuery code. If you just write $, you'll get an error that's going to be thrown by your browser saying that it can't recognize this function. Moving on to how to avoid conflicts with other plugin functions. So something to be aware of as a plugin developer is that any function that you're going to declare in your plugin is going to be global. So if you have duplicate names between your plugins and other plugins, you're going to get error messages. These will appear either during installation or during the actual refresh of your WordPress site. So what you should be careful about is to have unique names when you're writing on your own functions. You should also be really careful when you're doing some copy-paste. Copy-paste is great. You can find some great examples online. But if you do that, you should be careful and try to give unique names to your functions. So in general, what I would say here as a good practice would be to always prepend your function names with a unique identifier. So it could be something like here, LL for link library, in front of the function name. It could be the whole plugin name all spelled out. And so by doing this, then you're going to have a much better chance of having a unique function name inside of your plugin, as opposed to something very generic like HTTP get file, which in my case, I had a user install a plugin that had this exact same function name, and then there was a conflict. So avoid the headaches. Try to make sure that you have a prefix in front of all of your function names that's going to be unique to your own plugin. The next topic I want to talk about is avoiding problems with the WordPress automatic upgrade process. So since version 2.5, I can't remember exactly, there's been this great mechanism in WordPress that lets you automatically update plugins from the WordPress admin page. Now, that being said, while this mechanism can save you a lot of time and headaches, it can also create headaches specifically because of the way that it works. So when you say upgrade plugin, it's going to actually delete the entire plugin directory, and then it's going to load a new version of that plugin in there. What that means is that if you had any style sheet or any file that you expected the user to modify within your plugin, that file's gone, and it's going to be replaced by the original version of that file, meaning the user will lose all of his changes. So to work around that, well, unfortunately there's not that many solutions. Well, the first one isn't that great, and that is just to warn users to back up their files. That could be on the admin page, in the documentation, but we all know that users don't really read documentation. The other way to do it, which I found an interesting approach, is to try to really move all of the content inside of your plugin. And so that means that for something like a style sheet, you would need to create a style sheet editor right inside of your plugin admin pages so that the users could go in and edit their styles, and then this would be something that gets stored inside of the database. So next time there's a new update that rolls up for your plugin, they can just do the upgrade worry-free, and then it's going to find the information that it needs right there inside of the database and be able to keep moving and not rely on a user manual update of files or bringing back an old backup of their modified file after they've done the automatic update. Now, there's many other kinds of conflicts that can happen between WordPress and its different themes and plugins based on how a user has configured their site. The first one is that there's some plugins that depend on hooks to be able to do things inside of a WordPress installation. So for example, inside of the plugin code, you might be depending on queuing things to be printed in the header of the site or the footer of the site. So if you do that, well, then you're dependent on WP head or WP footer to actually be present in the theme. Now, I've actually had some themes that I recently upgraded to on my websites that were missing the footer call, the WP_footer function. So in that case, well, you end up with something that's not working right. Unfortunately, in this case, well, the only thing you can do when you're troubleshooting these things is, well, go and add documentation about the fact that there's dependencies on these things. And if you're trying to figure out, well, what's going on, if you're knowledgeable enough about what's happening in your plugin, then you can understand that there's things that are supposed to be out in the header or the footer and quickly look at these pieces of the page output to see what's missing. The next type of conflict that you can get into is conflicts with plugins that make their own changes to the page structure. So these days with things like jQuery, it's easy to go in and alter the page layout to be able to do a whole bunch of fancy things. So in my case, I had a user have a plugin installed that would give you a fade out and fade in effect whenever you would click on a link. And then he wrote to me saying, well, the link targets that I'm specifying in your plugin are not working. So after digging around the code of his page a little bit, I realized that the document object model, the DOM, was being played with, and so whatever targets were being set by my plugin based on what he would enter were all being overwritten. Similarly, I've had other plugins do nasty things like strip shortcodes. So I've had users have a shortcode in place and it wasn't working, and they would only see part of the shortcode on the output page. So these shortcodes were actually being stripped somewhere early on in the execution before WordPress actually had a chance to execute them and expand them to their full meaning. So unfortunately, the only way to be able to fix these kinds of issues is through live troubleshooting. So actually going in, looking around, activating and deactivating plugins that you suspect might be causing issues until you find the right one. Thankfully, at least in my case, I've had a lot of users that were very open to doing things like setting up a temp admin account for me, so I could actually go in and be able to see what's happening, do some of that experimentation myself, and then be able to give them a solution, or at least a way to be able to have their site work as they wanted. And so in some cases that means just leaving a plugin as being deactivated or replacing it. Finally, one thing to mention in terms of conflicts is that if you have a jQuery execution error on a page or a JavaScript execution error, that's going to bring down anything that's using these technologies. So if you have one plugin using jQuery that has an error inside of a function, well, that error is going to mean that all other jQuery code on that page is going to stop working correctly. So that's quite difficult to deal with. Again, the kind of thing you only realize through troubleshooting or through using great tools like Firebug, where you can actually go in and get errors that are going to tell you what's happening on the site. So at least there are some debugging capabilities there. And once you figure out where that's coming from, then you have a better idea of which plugin you should go in and try to deactivate and see if it fixes things. Something else to mention in terms of conflicts is that you can also have conflicts with the server installation. And by that, what I mean more specifically is that not all PHP or MySQL installations are equal. So there's various options that these different server packages have. For example, in PHP you have things like the short open tag that you can specify. That's not set by default. And so you should really avoid programming with these optional features in mind. So in the case of something like the PHP open tag, you should make sure that you're only writing your code with the full PHP open and close tags and not the short ones, because some people might not have them set and they might not have access to go and set these on their server. So going to the lowest common denominator would always be the safest thing to do here as a plugin developer, to make sure that your plugins are going to run everywhere. This one I've learned the hard way when I forgot a few tags and then uploaded the plugin to my test server. It worked fine. Uploaded it to my live server. It worked fine. But sure enough, a couple of my users quickly came back to me and were having all sorts of strange error messages, and it was due to these open and close tags not being correct inside of my code.